Welcome to today's CloudSuite Industrial Best Practices webinar, Planning in the Times of Uncertainty. I'm Emily Bohl, Marketing Manager at DRI. We've heard from a lot of our customers regarding the challenges you're facing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And while we wish we didn't have to host this webinar, we're happy to do what we can to help our customers, and we're glad that so many of you have been able to join us today. While no one could have predicted a global pandemic, our goal today is to help you move forward by demonstrating how to identify and respond to disruptions in your manufacturing processes. Presenting today is DRI business consultant Lee Lathrop. Lee joined DRI in 2005 and has 15 years of experience implementing ERP solutions with a focus on operations management, including forecasting, APS and MRP, scheduling, site lean, advanced order entry, and QCS. Lee has experience in the food, oil, heavy equipment, electronics, and lighting industries. Lee is a certified purchasing manager, Stephen Covey 7 Habits facilitator, Texas Quality Award examiner, and Deming advocate. Without further ado, Lee, take it away.
Good morning, welcome. I hope everybody's doing okay. These are interesting times, and there's a fair amount of uncertainty out there, and what we want to try and address in these times of uncertainty is, how do we utilize the tool sets that we have available in our system to help us get through some of the challenges, to maybe understand what is happening to us today, to be able to predict what's going to happen in the future with some amount of understanding and certainty. What I'm going to cover today are these topics, right? We're looking at disruptions in the availability of our workforce and in the supplies of the materials. So what we need to do is we need to find a way to understand what's happening to us. We need to understand the impact of suppliers not being able to deliver. We need to understand the impact of a shortage of specific resources, or maybe bulk resources in the hopefully not going to have to shut down the entire plant, but if we do, how do we account for a plant shutdown, right, for a period of time? So what do we do with lead times to customers? Because they still demand our products. What are we going to tell people is possible? How do we assess the supply chain today? Who's producing, who's not producing? Have we contacted them? How do we go out and reach out to our supply base and ask them questions? And finally, how do we come back? And so I've got a presentation at the things that we're going to talk about, but what I think we'd rather do is I think we'd rather come in here and we'd like to get into CloudSuite and walk through the things that CloudSuite can teach us. So I'm in a version 10 image. I realize there are people out there that may have version 8 images, version 9 images, and we're in version 10. Should be fairly similar, the forms and the functionality. The system that I'm in right now is running APS planning. So the tool sets that I'm going to be able to demonstrate here are focused on APS. But we'll talk about the MRP world, and we can bounce into some of the forms in an MRP world and take a look at them. But the functionality that I'm able to display this morning is going to be in an MRP mindset. So scenario number one, where we have deliveries that are delayed from a supplier. We need to identify the purchase orders, the vendors and purchase orders with a delay. If we have a delay, what we're going to do is we are going to open up the form, right, called purchase order lines, and you all know how to get there, right? We're going to open this form and we're going to open up purchase order lines. and we're opening up the lines because we really aren't interested in the header. We're more interested in where the action is at, right, which is purchase order lines. And we're going to come out here and take a look at orders that are in an ordered status. And when we get this amount of data for orders in an ordered status, we can do things with these orders. We can collapse on this, and here we see associated vendors. So we could export this data and we could see the open orders for a vendor. We could zip this cell and we could send this off to the suppliers and say, hey, tell us what you think. Number one, do you agree that these are the open orders that you have in front of you? And number two, can you please tell us any information you can about what our expected delivery dates are? When they feed back to us, what we're going to do is we're going to change the due date here on the customer orders. We're going to take a concerted effort to figure out when the orders are going to be available, or the materials are going to be available to us via the purchase order lines form. We're going to adjust the due dates in the form, and then we're going to use planning. If you're an MRP environment, we're going to run planning after that, and we're going to run planning, and we're going to look at first exception messages, and the exception messages that we're going to be interested in are move in the receipt. We want to hear from the system after we adjust the purchase order lines. We want to move up the exception message priority on move in receipt, and we want to look at what the system is saying to us that we should bring forward because we just pushed a bunch of stuff out. When we get that in place, right, we run the exception message report. And you know how to run the exception message report, right? The exception messages, you run the report and you tell the exception message to run for a range of planner codes, a range of items, and this exception priority right here says what exception priority level do we want to run for. So if we have updated our exception message priorities and we have moved move in receipt to 00, which is the high exception report, and we could put the exception level as 00, and we could run this report, and these are the items that the system is telling us to pull in. With that information, we know, uh-oh, planning's thought we had this material available, now it's not available, now it's telling us to pull this in. How do we peg up from there to find the customer orders that are associated with these items that we just pushed out? If you have a shortage analysis that you have created in an MRP environment, then we're going to use the shortage analysis to look at the shortages that we have and the associated customer orders, and we're going to move those customer orders out and the associated job orders. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's important in a few minutes, but we want to understand what materials are delayed from a supplier, utilize the exception reporting in the system, and utilize that to come up with an understanding of what we need to pull in to satisfy customer orders, but we know that we can't because we just adjusted all of those purchase order due dates. And then we peg up to the job orders and the customer orders, and we say, these are going to have to go out. As an aside, if we go into planning detail, you know that you can come in here and select the specific exception message that you want to look at, move in receipt, and you can turn the filter off and you will get a listing of all of the purchase orders where the system says, and especially if you have this updated with your planner codes, and you can see which of the purchase orders you need to pull in. So number one, where we have a delay in a delivery where a supplier has said, it's not going to be this date, it's going to be this date, we update the purchase order lines, we run MRP planning, and then we go in and we look at our exception messages. We pull the exception messages with either the exception message report or through planning detail, and then we peg up to the job orders and the customer orders associated with that, and we move those dates. That's in an MRP environment. In an APS environment, we do the same preliminary steps. We come in and we identify which orders are out there. We perform the push outs on those orders. We go to the, I'm sorry, I closed that, didn't I? Darn it. We're going to go to purchase order lines and we're going to find the orders that are in an ordered status, and we're going to update their due dates that have been communicated to us from a supplier about delays, and we're going to adjust all of the purchase orders, and then we're going to run APS planning. We can either push out in an APS environment, we can push out the due date, or we can come to the items form and we can go to the additional planning tab and we can tell the system for purchased items, this is the earliest planned purchase receipt we're going to get for this item. Either way works, either coming out to the purchase order line and moving the due date on the individual purchase order lines, or going to the items form itself and saying, this is the earliest date that we're going to receive this material. And the APS engine recognizes, yeah, we need it, but we're not going to get it until a certain date. We run one is we're going to go into planning parameters, and we're going to come over here to planning parameters form, and we're going to open that up. And if we are using expedited lead times in our planning process, we want to turn off using expedited lead times, because what we're trying to understand is the the vendors have pushed us out. We want to see the impact on that push out. And if we don't turn off using expedited lead times, it's going to tell us to rebuy the item that we just pushed out on the purchase order line. So we need to momentarily get rid of using expedited lead times prior to running APS planning. When we run APS planning, we're going to open up my favorite form in the whole system, and we're going to look at demand summary APS. We adjusted the purchase orders. We turned off use expedited lead times. We ran APS planning, and we're going to look at customer orders. We could look at job orders. We're going to look at customer orders, and we're going to take the filter off, and we're going to see which orders are now projected late. This form shows us the projected late, where the delta between the due date and the projected date, the projected date is greater than the due date. And so these are the orders that we need to work and move them out, because it's simply not going to happen because we have a shortage. Another form that we can use in APS is we can use the item bottlenecks form after we do all of the push outs. When we do the push outs on the purchased items, right, we can come in here to the item bottlenecks report, and the item bottlenecks does a very nice thing for us. It says this item is delaying these 20 demands, and it lists the 20 demands for us. So APS provides us some nice pegging tools to be able to identify an item that's having a problem and the demands that are associated with that problem. We come in and we fix the customer order due date equal to the projected date. unless we can, do an alternate item or something of that nature, right? But if the vendor has told us we're not going to be able to deliver this material, then we come in here and we change the customer order line from the due date to the projected date. It's really important that we start massaging the system and letting the system understand that there are going to be move outs. One of the reasons that we're doing that is we're doing that from a customer service perspective. If we can't get materials, we should let the planning engine tell us what it thinks is possible, and then we go back to the customer orders and we move the due date to the projected date. And then we broadcast out to the customers and say, hey, this is what we think is likely at this point in time. So we've got some nice tools, right, with APS to allow us to investigate and understand shortages. Delayed deliveries from a supplier, scenario B. Scenario A was when the supplier could tell us that they were having a shortage issue, but they said they were going to get it to us in 2 weeks, right? Scenario A is where we went in and we said, show us the troubled orders, the orders that do our analysis in either MRP or APS to massage job orders and customer orders. Scenario B is where the supplier comes and says, frankly, I don't know what to tell you about when this material is going to be available. In that instance, what we're suggesting is taking the order and changing it from an order to a filled status. When I change this order to a filled status, it still says we ordered 1,000, we wanted them on this date, but we have changed the status to a filled status, so planning retains the information about the existing order, but planning will not see the supply from this purchase order because we changed its status to filled. It acts like, well, we don't know, we had a purchase order out there, but now that purchase order is gone. The supply is gone. It's not, right? We still have the purchase order open. We just changed it to a filled status. And later, when we want to undo this, we can come in and we can say, show me purchase orders where the status is filled, but the quantity that we received is 0. And now we have a listing of those purchase orders that we changed to a filled status to get them out of the supply plan. And now we run MRP planning, and we go through and we look at our shortage reports and we look at the signals that we get from those, and we go in and we adjust the job orders and we adjust the customer orders for the shortage in supply. In an APS environment, it's we turn off use expedited lead times because it's going to try and plan this material again. And we go out there and we say, all right, we don't have this material. We do not have this material today. And we go out and we run APS planning and we start looking at all of the information now that's available to us in demand summary about the push outs because we don't have material available. And we start going through and adjusting the job orders and the customer orders accordingly, and we make notation of how we move them out, right? Because we still have we could leave the requested date on those customer orders about what their original request was, but we're changing the date on that customer order to reflect what we think the current position is. I want to go back to the items form, and I want to focus for a few minutes on this field. The field that we're looking at on the items form is this earliest planned purchase receipt date. If the supplier comes back, if suppliers come back and they say, I can't tell you, Well, maybe we should take this earliest planned purchase date and maybe we should punch it out until August, because we simply don't know when the material is going to be available. So even though there is demand for an item, even though there is a lead time on the item, if we come in here to the additional planning tab on the earliest planned purchase receipt date, the system is going to say to us, you can't have it. I see you need it. I see there's a lead time, but we're indicating to you that you can't have it any earlier than this date. And if we run planning after that, then what's going to happen to us is, so what is the impact now on that customer order? You want to know what some of these fields do? Right click in them, go to the help form, and pay attention to the help and the things that we need to look at when we look at this. The help is very good. This field applies to APS and is used only for purchased items. So guess what? Earliest planned purchase receipt does not apply to MRP. Earliest planned purchase receipt does not apply to manufactured or transferred items. So the help is pretty good in identifying what the field does and where its application can be useful. Sound okay? Hey, I'm asking questions and y'all are muted. How about that? Does that work? So we come through if we have a disruption and we don't know when we're going to get the material. Our methodology then becomes one of going out and changing the status of ordered purchase orders for those materials that we can't have available, and changing their status to filled, and or coming to the items form and updating the earliest planned purchase receipt, run MRP planning, run APS planning, and then use the tool sets that you're using today, either your shortage report in MRP or in APS. We're using the demand summary APS and we're using the items bottleneck report to see the impacts of a supplier that simply can't deliver material. Okay. Shortage. So you need two things to make an item, right? You need materials and you need resources. So let's say our scenario shifts to, we have resources that are not going to be available, a specific set of resources, not the entire plant, just a specific set of resources are not going to be available. So how do we indicate to the system that those resources are not available? We come to the resources tab and we find the resources that are going to be offline for a period of time. We come into that resource and we go to shift exceptions and we start writing our shift exception, right? What's the shift exception ID? And you can put some intelligent numbering schema in there. You know, what's the description? Heaven forbid this is going to be like, horrible information, isn't it? COVID-19. From this date to this date, this resource is down on shift number 1, on the first shift. When you save this shift exception record, it says this resource is not going to be available from this date to this date on this shift. We can take a resource offline. We do that, we enter the relevant information, we save the changes that we have made to our resources, and then we run planning. And if you're in an MRP environment, we're going to run scheduling. Some of you may be saying, yeah, we're in an MRP environment and we don't run scheduling today. Okay, we can turn scheduling on and we can turn scheduling off. So for a period of time, we're going to run scheduling so that we get an awareness of the impact that our resources are not available. Resources. And then we come into our resource group forms and we take a look out here and we say, I want to look 10 weeks out at this resource group with a threshold of 80%. And when we go and we look at that resource group, it shows us the utilization. And the utilization numbers are on shift hours against total load. So if we're going in and we are writing resources out of our plan by writing a shift exception on that resource, then the on-shift hours for that resource group goes down. The load didn't change, but the resource availability, the on-shift hours went down, and the utilization as expressed as a percentage of load over on shift increased, and we know got a problem. There are some very nice graphics available to us to show us the impact of that. And we can see the impact and we can see, look, in this week right here, because I chose to look at these intervals in instead of days, we have 192 on shift hours. We got 171 scheduled hours. Whoops, planned hours, stuff that we haven't released yet is 605 for a total of 777 or a utilization of 400%. That's not going to happen, right? So we utilize this tool set, we use it in APS. When you run APS planning, this functionality, when you run APS Infinite, this functionality is resident in our tool sets today if you've got the structures set up to report on it, right? The resources aligned with resource groups and on shift hours and all of that good stuff. So it shows us this information, and when we go, oh my gosh, that's not going to happen, I need to push something out, then we go to the resource group plan, and we look at the resource group plan, and we say, what are the specific job orders, right? What are the specific loads, job orders with a number of piece turning into a number of load hours? So if I have, right, 192 hours, I have to do something with any of these planned hours in excess of the 192 hours of availability. So this resource group plan gives me a really nice way of going out into the system and saying, what is the impact of these resources being offline? And then, as painful as it might be, we move that job order. Where do we need to move that job order? Well, we need to move it out to when we believe the resources are going to become available again. We move the job orders and we move the subsequent customer orders. And I'm going to come back in a couple of minutes and tell you why I keep on urging us to move customer orders and job orders, as painful as that might be. I'd like to speak to you about why I think that's important. So we come in here and we identify the job orders and the customer order demands that need to go out. When we push the customer order demands out, then we have an opportunity to call up the customer and say to them, hey, sorry, our best guess at this point based on material and resource availability is here. Instead of waiting, right, in a vacuum with, we can show our clients that we've got our act somewhat together and can produce information for them to say, best guess at this point in time is that we think we're going to be available to satisfy you on this date. Scenario number one is when we had resources that were going to be unavailable for a period of time, and we wrote a shift exception saying from this period of time, this resource is going to be unavailable. When we did that, it impacted our on-shift hours, and when it impacted our on-shift hours, then we could see what of the resources, what of the loads trying to impact that resource group need to be moved out. APS, you get this if you've got the system set up, correctly. You get it free every night when planning runs. MRP, if you're running scheduling, you get this amount of detail. If you're not running scheduling today, you can. The scheduling tool set in your MRP environment is available. Just need to have some understanding of how to turn that on, right? Again, there's all kinds of help manuals out there available, to come in and take a look at how to do that. All right, that's a scenario where a group of resources, we want to take a group of resources, a department, if you will, a shift, a group of resources and take them offline. If we want to take the entire plant offline, and this is the weirdest thing, isn't it? We're going to go to our holiday calendar. And what the holiday calendar does says, look, 12/25/2020 is a holiday. And the planning system, when it starts to calculate its MCAL, its manufacturing calendar comprised of M days, manufacturing days, it recognizes that 12/25 is not going to be a manufacturing day, so it doesn't include it in the manufacturing calendar. And so it says, well, we don't have any availability of resources that day. So if I could use this holiday calendar, oh my goodness, is that a misnomer, right? And come in here and say for the next month, we would like the system to recognize that these days are not going to be available to the planning engine. We would come into the holiday calendar, and for those number of days, we would write them up as holidays, and the planning engine would say, okay, new MCAL, new manufacturing calendar, do not include these days. Then we run planning, MRP with scheduling, or APS. And in an APS environment, we do the exact same thing that we were talking about doing before. We'd start with resource group utilization APS, and we would look at what happened to our on-shift hours, right? A bunch of short-term on-shift hours would go away because they're not available, but the load would still be out there, and we would have an indication of the loads equal to the customer orders and the job orders where we have demand for these resources, and we would shove the due date out on the customer orders to represent what we think is going to be achievable to us in the future. So we got two things to do, right, for resources. Do I have a group of resources that are coming offline, or do I have the entire plant that's coming offline? And how do we go in with the different tool sets? Number one, adjust the MCAL, and then run planning, PS planning or MRP with scheduling, and then perform an assessment of what the impact is. So customers are going to be concerned about delivery dates. And so if I updated my materials and I updated my resources and I run my planning tool sets and say, take a look at the existing customer orders that are in house. Now that we have updated our purchase orders, now that we've updated our resources, tell me what you think is going to be possible for us to produce. We do that, we run planning. In an MRP environment, we look at our shortage reports and we look to identify which orders need to go out because they have shortages either in resources or in item availability, and we move those customer orders. That's important. If we are in an environment where we have one or two suppliers who have said to us, we can't deliver the material to you, then what we do is we go back in and we move out those purchase orders, which is going to tell us to move out those customer orders. And when we move out those customer orders that are impacted by a shortage, and we take them out by 1 or 2 months, then all of the other materials and the resources that were associated with that customer order that we just moved out are now going to become allocatable to other orders that may be in, a shorter time frame window. So if I have a group of orders and they're impacted by one, we shove those orders out. And those orders were probably allocating demand to other materials and to resources. So when we move them out, the allocations for these other materials and the resources free up. So maybe we can make something that we couldn't have made because the material was allocated to something that's now got a shortage, and we move the shortage out. So when we move the orders out, we relieve the allocation of the resources and materials and take a look at the plan, and maybe there are some things that we could make. So we would like to keep customers informed about what is happening and move the orders out to something credible so that they're aware of it, and we're releasing the allocations of materials and resources for other demands that potentially could be made. We've talked about how to come through here and do the resource adjustments, right? And scheduling can provide us with these load profiles. I like this view, right? I like this view because it tells me here are my on-shift availabilities, and here it tells me my different kinds of loads, and it tells me where I'm at. This is good information. I can get this information, not this exact information, but I can get some information using the scheduling tool set in MRP. But in an APS environment, if we've got it set up correctly, I can get this information all day, every day, and make informed decisions about what to do with this. Okay. We need an ongoing effort starting today to come into the system and start to move customer order and job order demands out. Because starting today, orders, or maybe last week, right? Orders are going stale. That's a fair statement, I think. Orders are going stale. We can't ship, and so they're past due. And if we don't massage those past due orders, when we do have the ability to come back into production, we're going to have this big bow wave of past due customer orders to deal with. If we don't start massaging the customer orders and the job orders today and move them out to something that looks like a credible plan out into the future, we're going to experience this bow wave of demand that is going to overwhelm and swamp our ability. Because when you have a bunch of past due demand, either customer orders, forecasts, or job orders, everything looks like it's urgent. And so then somebody has to weed through this big pile of demand that has built up that's past due and try and make some sense of it. And my suggestion is, let's not wait for that to happen. Let's get out there in front of this thing and let's start massaging those customer orders and forecasts and job orders to create a plan out there in the future that will then blow demand down through our resources and through our purchase components to start to turn off some of the deliveries. Because if we don't turn off the deliveries and our customer orders out into the future, the planning engine is sitting there going, okay, let's buy it. Let's bring it in. Let's bring in some more. Let's bring in some more. Okay. I hope that makes sense. I want to touch on something that is easy to do. Something that is easy to do when we get this bow wave of demand coming to us. It's easy to assume that we're going to generate a hot list. I would like you to avoid the hot list. I would like you to please go out and adjust the customer orders and the job orders in the system and avoid using an offline spreadsheet that isn't tied into the planning engine to try and create the priorities for what we want to run. Because an offline spreadsheet that is not tied into my planning data is going to rob me of resources and materials, and in some ways it will throw chaos into the supply chain, and I just need a credible plan, and I can create one credible plan by going in and massaging the customer orders and the job orders at this point in time. So I'm trying to encourage, let's get in front of that activity today the best we can. Assessing the supply chain. We need to assess how vendors are capable of satisfying component demand. I think a great place to start is the vendor contracts form, and I'm hoping that that vendor contracts form is updated and current for us. So if a vendor says to me, hey, we're having trouble supplying materials, then I can come in here to the vendor contracts form and I can see here are all of the items that we get from this vendor. In addition to that, if my system is keeping records the way we would like it to keep records, it's saying, here's how many purchases we did this year, here's how many we received this year, so I can not only see what my components are from this vendor, but I can also see whether they're active or not. Just because I don't have an open purchase order at this moment with this vendor does not mean that I don't need to assess that vendor's ability to supply me in the future. So if I think a great place to start is with the vendor contract form, because it's creating the association between the vendor and the items, and I can get some bits of information about whether this is an active item for us or not. In an APS environment, we've got a couple of really nice tools to use. Component shortages APS, right? Component shortages APS, we looked at this a moment ago, right? For a specific demand ID, I can see all of the components that were short on a specific demand. Using this in conjunction with the item bottlenecks report, the item bottlenecks report can show me what demands are delayed because we're having trouble getting an item, right? And I like the ability from the item bottlenecks form to peg up for me. I like the ability of the component shortage form to peg down for me, right? Because the components form can show me a demand ID, the component shortages form, and it can show me that for this customer order, I'm missing these items. So in an APS environment, got some really nice tools to understand the connectivity between items and their availability. One other thing I might mention is that if we are using vendor contracts appropriately, it might be appropriate in some of these tool sets to align items with the vendor, maybe using the planner code, so that I would not necessarily have to get to vendor information. But when we open up planning detail and we wanted to look at exception messages called move-in receipt, I could go, and if I had my planner codes aligned, then I could run this query, if you will, from planning detail on items where the exception message is move-in receipt for a specific vendor. If we're running the past due purchase orders report, the past due purchase order report itself, if I take this purchase order and I crank that due date somewhere out into the future, it's not only going to show me the current past dues, but it's also going to show me anything that will be past due based on this due date. And I could run it by vendor, I could run it by item, and I could get all of the purchase orders, if I like reports, all of the purchase orders out there, including blanket orders, to show me the listing of all of the open orders for a supplier. Well, why not run this, send it to the supplier and say, hey, are we still on schedule? Anything, giving you any concern here? It's a nice way of going in, I think, because I can punch this date out into the future. And of course, if you've got data views, it would be easy to extract this information also, right? We need to be ready for when we come back into production. We need to get our supplies and our resources available. So it's going to be important for us to manage orders and forecasts today, so that when we want to come back, we have a credible plan in place. We can get the system. Ooh, I'm typing too fast. There's a button on here in an APS environment. Again, there's a button on here, and the button says pull up order. If I have managed request dates on the customer order lines, and if materials and resources become available to me, this pull-up order will attempt to pull an order back into the request date, APS planning, and it's going to try and grab and pull forward demands that were previously pushed out. I'm making it sound really simple. It's not just as simple as pull up order, right? And when we go to the help form here and take a look at this, you can see that the help is fairly good for it. It's not as simple as this form applies. So if you're going to do that and it's cool functionality, do some research about what this does, because it can do interesting things to the planning engine. We need to come through and back through the things that we did when we're coming back. If we change the holiday calendar, go back in and change it to eliminate the days that are still showing as calendars. If we change the resources to have shift exceptions to the resources and get rid of the shift exceptions. After we do that, run planning and scheduling and see what it looks like from a load profile. Make adjustments, assess the loads in the system, based on these due dates. And if we have changed the planning parameters to go in, and we said in planning parameters that for a period of time, we did not want to use expedited lead times, we need to turn that back on. If we went into some items and we changed the earliest planned purchase receipt, we need to take that off. If we went to purchase order lines and we changed purchase order lines from ordered to a filled status, take them back to an ordered status so that we can see that we think that those materials are still going to come back in place. There's more than one way to do this. Some people want to adjust their resources and then see what the material plan looks like. Some people want to adjust the material plan and then see what the resource availability is. There's no right way to do that. One thought process might be, if I have the materials, then I can get the resources available to satisfy the demand. But if I don't have the materials, having a great plan in place isn't going to do me any good. So you might want to look at the way you come back to say, let's get the material plan in place and get the materials flowing to us, and then come back and assess the potential overload conditions.